Good evening and welcome to Gambakwe Media. 26th of July 2023. Thanks to my friend Pardon Gambakwe, today I'm in his seat and I'll be doing an editorial or a review of some few questions that we have today. It's exactly 27 days before the watershed harmonized elections in Zimbabwe. Today, I am tackling two very pertinent questions that confront Zimbabwe. The first question is, how does power change hands in Zimbabwe? And the second question is, will President Mnangagwa hand over power to Advocate Nelson Chamisa if he wins the upcoming elections? These questions are crucial, particularly on the backdrop of a flurry of surveys that have been released recently or published, which point to a victory by Advocate Nelson Chamisa and the CCC. I am going to divide my presentation into four parts. Right. The first part, I'm going to deal with the question, what are the constitutional provisions guiding the transition of power in Zimbabwe? On the second part, I will answer the question, what are the historical facts about power transition in Zimbabwe? And what are the factors that affect that power transition or the lack of it? Now, third part, I will present my own opinion on what I foresee happening post 23 August, and this based on the historical facts. I normally want to take you into the historical purview because it helps us to understand what is likely to happen. Then number 4, I will then conclude by suggesting remedial action should what we fear for happen. Now, let me go to the first question. What are the constitutional provisions guiding transition of power in Zimbabwe? Number 1, our constitution of 2013 does not have a clear outline of how power transitions from one administration to another. It is silent. I've also tried to ask Professor Maduku on whether there is legislation that clearly guides how power transitions. By the time I came on air, he had not responded. In some democracies, dates of elections and transitional periods are legislated. I'll give for an example of the United States of America. We know that the election date is the 4th of November each election year, and that the date of the swearing in of the new president or the new administration is the 20th of January after that election. In Zimbabwe, we can only piece up details by reading the Constitution in Chapter 5, where it talks about the executive. I think it's subsection 94, which talks about the assumption of office by the president and the vice presidents. It says, a person elected as president only assumes office when he or she takes oath before a chief justice or the next senior judge. This, according to the Constitution, should be done on the 9th day after he or she has been declared the winner. In the event of a challenge of the validity of his or her election, within 48 hours after the Constitutional Court has declared him or her the winner, then he or she should be sworn in. That's what the Constitution says. Then the Constitution talks about when a president resigns from power. So it says, or rather the Constitution provides for resignation of the president by a written notice to the Speaker of Parliament, who then gives public notice of resignation as soon as is possible, that is within 24 hours. Again, another method here where we can see that there will be a change of administration is when there is a vote of no confidence. We saw this almost happening under President Mugabe, though it did not happen. Now, the next point is, in case of a resignation, of a vote of no confidence, the office is then assumed or exercised rather by either the first VP or the second VP, or by a minister designated by the president. Or if there is no minister designated by the president, then a minister that is nominated by cabinet. And obviously there are various other ways in which, there is also the issue of death, that when he dies, then the last acting VP will then take over and so forth. But there is no outright, section which tells us the step-by-step, way of transitioning from one administration to the other. So, as you can see, there is no section in our constitution that talks to the changing of power in Zimbabwe. Then I move on to the next section, the next part of my presentation. What is the historical context of Zimbabwe in terms of change of power? What are the historical facts that we can glean about power transition in Zimbabwe? And what are those factors that affect the power transition or the lack thereof? Before I even talk about change of power from one administration to a completely new administration, one needs to interrogate the existence or lack thereof of a culture of succession or transition in Zimbabwean politics. This will help us to focus objectively what is likely to take place post 23 August 2023. In ZANU-PF, talk of succession or transition is taboo. Since independence, after President Mugabe had ascended to be the leader of ZANU-PF and the leader of the country, both ZANU-PF and the country have never known any other leader except President Mugabe, and this for 37 years. Anyone suspected to have ambitions to President Mugabe's throne was dealt with severely, and this, we know it. In fact, the culture of elimination of political opponents who were deemed to harbor presidential ambitions has always dogged ZANU-PF since pre-independence into the post-independence. I'll take you through some of those. In 1974, we are all aware of the Nari rebellion. I will not get deeper into that, but we all know what happened to those who dared to challenge the powers that be. In 1975, the ouster of Mnangagwa from ZANU, we know that it was all an issue of transition, of succession there. And Mnangagwa was ousted. Then, if you go to 1975, the assassination of Herbert Wilshire Chitepo is known to have been, or is suspected, is still controversial today, is suspected to be an inside job, because of jostling of power. And therefore, it is believed to be an act of the succession struggles within ZANU-PF. Fast forward to 1979, the assassination of Josiah Gamatongogara. It is again widely believed that that was part of the power struggles within ZANU-PF. And if you look at the pre-independence situation, it can show you that there was an issue with a change of power there. Post-independence, look at the expulsion of Edgar Tekere in 1988. Edgar Tekere was known to be a critic of corruption, and particularly of President Robert Mugabe's way of ruling, and particularly when he challenged the one-party state. He was booted out. Go on to the 1995, the Margaret Dongo debacle, in which she was basically excluded from running as a parliamentary candidate, whereupon she moved on to to then run as an independent. Who would forget 1997, the Dzikamaima virus fiasco, you know, when he dared to say Mugabe must go. You know, that was part of succession in ZANU-PF. Dzikamaima virus was fired from ZANU-PF. Let's fast forward to 2004, which is a recent time, the Cholocho Declaration, where 6 out of 10 provinces had endorsed President Mnangagwa, the current president, as the next vice president, and they were preparing him, obviously, to then succeed President Mugabe. But we know what happened, that they ended up being suspended, and a host other senior ZANU-PF officials were suspended. This talks to the toxicity of transition within ZANU-PF itself and within the state level. Right. Then we move on to 2014. We saw the ouster of Mai Mujuru, who again was suspected of harboring ambitions of being president. And we know how she was accused of going to Ngangas to go and seek powers so that she can succeed President Mugabe. Whether that was true or false. But I'm highlighting this to show you the historical context of transition of power in Zimbabwe, and particularly in ZANU-PF, which is the national party anyway. Then, lastly but not least, the ouster of Emerson Mnangagwa in 2017, where paakanzi ndinomudonhedza na President Mugabe. You know, we know the fights that were there, the factionalism between Lacoste and the G40. So this highlights what I've just said. It highlights the state of succession, the state of transition within ZANU-PF, and by extension in Zimbabwe at state level. So a conglomerate of all these events clearly shows that ZANU-PF has never nurtured a culture of succession where a new pair of hands are given an opportunity to have its hands on the deck, so to speak. Now, this culture has been transposed to the national body politic. What do I mean? In ZANU-PF, power is regarded as a trophy. That's how I view it. It is regarded as a trophy whose winner has to die with it. Upresident unenge ushe kana uri mZANU-PF. Kana watowana unongobva kana wafa. Right? Now, the mantra, we know the mantra of there is no vacancy in the presidium. It became very, very common under President Mugabe. But it shows you that there were simmering talks, there was simmering whispers of transition, of changing from an older generation of Robert Mugabe to a new generation. Right. It is therefore my contention today that it is folly for one to expect ZANU-PF to practice peaceful power transfer at the national level when they cannot practice it within their own party in-house. Research shows that everywhere where there are tyrannical, authoritarian, and dictatorial regimes, succession or transitional times are considerably a risky moment and are very precarious, right? And so the discourse of succession presents a very contested and topical issue in Africa, and in particular in Zimbabwe, which I'm discussing today. The Afrobarometer survey of 2015 on on political succession in Zimbabwe in particular, it has shown, not only in Zimbabwe but even in Africa, it has shown that African countries, and in particular Zimbabwe, manipulate and exploit state apparatus to further their narrow interests at the expense, of course, of peace, stability, and development. In the context of Zimbabwe, this view is compounded by things we see on a daily basis. It is compounded by what is happening today, the never-ending muzzling of dissent, which accumulates into creation of strong men or strong personalities For instance, right now, there is no doubt President Mnangagwa is a strong man. Vachiwenga is a strong man. And against strong men, weak institutions, weak police service, a weak judiciary, weak commissions, whether they are anti-corruption commissions, human rights commissions, all of them are weak and they cannot hold those in power to account. So again in Zimbabwe, we look at the tempering and an amendment of constitutions, like the recent amendment of the constitution, was it in 2021, which was very, very unnecessary. Rampant politics of patronage and patrimonialism, where ZANU-PF elites are engrossed in power consolidation and wealth accumulation. And in this case, the major patron being the president at the helm, who then mobilizes those who hope to benefit or to be rewarded from his from his mercy. And him, the patron, implements cohesive support. We know how the war veterans are used in this. And in recent times, we've seen the creation of organizations such as FAS. We have seen the creation of dubious organizations such as Pastors for ED, such as Teachers for ED. There are many, some which are embarrassing to even speak on air. Right. We have seen the cartels, which are meant to provide wealth bastion for the leader in power. And because he is the conduit or the benefactor of the gains of corruption, he is kept in power at all costs by his beneficiaries. And this continues to happen. And that hampers transition, basically, in my view. Now, let me move on to say, in Zimbabwe, there are only 4 times when power either changed hands or was somehow reconfigured or was shared. Twice, power changed completely from one administration to a completely new administration. Twice. Right. Once it was reconfigured, and once again it was only once it was shared. Now, when was it sorry, you remove this. What is common though with all these changes, and I'm going to talk about them, is the extreme violence and brutality that preceded these reconfigurations or these changes. Right? In all these change matrices, ZANU-PF was involved. That's another thing to note. Right? In all the instances but one, ZANU-PF was the perpetrator of the violence. Right? Only in that change which occurred in 1980, where ZANU-PF was the main liberation party and was at the receiving end of violence from the Rhodesian Front. But what is in no doubt is that in this transition, they were armed and had the support of the international community. Now, let me talk of these 4 changes briefly. The first change I'm talking about is the 1980 change, where we moved from the Rhodesian Front to ZANU-PF. Right. That transition occurred and it was a completely different one. Then I've talked of the reconfiguration of power in 1987. That is after the Matabeleland disturbances. Then we saw power being reconfigured. Remember, it was we had a ceremonial president in President Banana and Prime Minister Robert Mugabe, who was the executive prime minister. And after the disturbance of the Matabeleland, in the Matabeleland, we then saw the institution of an executive presidency, where President Mugabe moved on to be the president, and Mr. Joshua Nkomo became the vice president, with not much power though. Then we move on to 2009, with the power sharing government, where ZANU-PF was beaten by MDC-T. And then what happened was that after the runoff, which was also rejected by the region, we saw power being shared between President Mugabe and Morgan Tsvangirai. But we all know that much of the executive power, though it was shared, it lied with President Mugabe. Then the fourth change of power was that of November 2017. That was basically a coup in which we saw President Mugabe being deposed from power by the current president, Emmerson Mnangagwa. Now, let me come to the third part of this question. Will President Mnangagwa and ZANU-PF hand over power to Advocate Nelson Chamisa in the impending defeat which we have seen courtesy of the surveys that we have? President Mnangagwa, there is something that I want to mention there. President Mnangagwa has been a key, if not a key figure, if not the most important enforcer of ZANU-PF philosophy and policies over the years, before independence and after independence, holding key positions and ministries. Besides being a special aide to President Mugabe, he was Minister of Intelligence, he was Minister of Defense, he was Minister of Justice, and he was very instrumental in the post-election violence, that we have seen or witnessed in Zimbabwe since independence. And I'm going to highlight that. As a liberation fighter, remember, President Mnangagwa is well known for having survived the hangman's snooze after bombing a Rhodesian train, I think in the 70s, late 70s there. And I'm bringing this point up to show you that he has never changed his modus operandi pre and post independence. Now, he was fingered, President Mugabe, post independence. He was fingered in the Matabeleland disturbances as Minister of State Intelligence. That violence, it then preceded the Unity Accord with the President of ZAPU, Joshua Nkomo, in 1987. He was working for ZANU again. He was working for ZANU-PF during the run-up to the violent 2002 presidential election, which was later challenged by Morgan Tsvangirai, and whose petition we know is still gathering dust somewhere in the High Court. And one thing to note is that it is widely believed that Morgan Tsvangirai had won that election, but we never saw a transition. Another thing to note is that by his own admission, President Mnangagwa was involved in the violence that occurred in the run-up to the 2008 runoff election. You know, a bloody ZANU-PF, we all know, a bloody ZANU-PF campaign ensued, which killed more than 300 MDC-T activists, according to the Zimbabwe Peace Project research that they did. Morgan Tsvangirai would pull out of that election. And President Mnangagwa would further on, as we remember, brag that he orchestrated the runoff after the likes of Didmus Mutasa had ran away. Furthermore, President Mnangagwa it's common knowledge to all of us that he was the architect of the 2017 coup, because he was the major beneficiary of it. He would then come to lead the country after that coup. Then we go on to 2018, after the election and the dispute that ensued. We all know that 7 Zimbabweans were gunned down under his leadership. To date, no one has been brought to book, despite the Motlanthe Commission recommendations. Again, if you look at it, the build up to the 26th March 2022 by-elections, which is an important precursor to this election, it was bloody and violent, and ZANU-PF was the major culprit there of the perpetration of violence. the death of Mboneni Ncube is a case in point. Now, the CCC or the Triple C in those by-elections won resoundingly. And now ZANU-PF is acting like a cornered cat. Its behavior is there for all to see. The incessant banning of opposition rallies, lawfare that they are implementing right now against opponents. We know Xavier Kasukwere is in the courts fighting to just represent his country. We know about the 11 parliamentary seats that ZANU-PF is challenging, all to make sure that Triple C candidates do not participate in an election. The violence which is happening everywhere, the refusal to by the progress of ZANU, of course, ZEC, to release their voters' roll on time. We know already of the controversial delimitation report. We know that the Triple C till to date is blacked out from the national broadcaster and the national press. We know of the gory death threats rather that have been issued by non-ZANU-PF apparatchiks to Triple C activists with impunity, and no one has ever been brought to book. It is therefore again my contention that given this historical behavior by ZANU-PF of intolerance, of impunity, of entitlement, that if they lose, if President Mnangagwa loses, he is not going to give up power rather easily. One way or the other, they will revert to their default setting: violence, bloody violence. That is how I see things panning out. However, I'm not going to end on a gloomy and dismal note about what is likely to happen post 23 August. Remedies are available, a lot of them, and I'm sure out there are many people who have got many other remedies that they can offer. But for me, voters out there have the key. Come out to vote en masse and vote overwhelmingly. And in this case, the only other alternative is the Triple C. And it will become difficult for ZANU-PF to subvert the will of the people. Right. The second remedy is, I think, the Triple C should make sure that the issue of polling agents who are fully resourced is attended to. They must be there to make sure that they follow up what is happening pre, during, and post the election itself. Number 3, or is it number 4? The Triple C should use the remaining 1 month or so to put boots on the ground and convince undecided voters, as we have seen in the surveys. They must convince them, sway them, so that they can come vote overwhelmingly, I think, for the alternative. And then number 4, Advocate Nelson Chamisa should engage robustly engage the SADC regional group and the African Union to the situation unfolding in Zimbabwe, this very bad situation unfolding in Zimbabwe. And I also hope the observers will be very much aware to what is happening, where on one hand ZANU-PF is preaching peace, but on the other hand they are exercising violence. So if there is an overwhelming Triple C victory, I want to believe that a good number of leaders in this region, in the SADC region, will not allow a coup on an election of Advocate Nelson Chamisa or on the people's will. Then number 5, the Triple C should engage the UN through SADC. And this has happened in 1980, so that the UN can underwrite this election. And lastly, but obviously not least, Advocate Nelson Chamisa should make a bold move to form the next government once results show that he has won, and everything, I believe everything, will gradually fall into place. These are my opinions that I am expressing right here, not necessarily Gambakwe's opinions. And I believe these opinions clearly answer to the pertinent questions that were before us of how does power change hands in Zimbabwe, and will President Mnangagwa hand over power to Advocate Nelson Chamisa should he lose the election, as the surveys are showing. Thank you very much to all our viewers, and a very good night to you all.